Our podcast is brought to you by We Push Back. In the last few years, a certain genre on social media has been plagued with informants who misrepresent the truth to benefit themselves. They've gone unchecked for far too long. This smoke and mirrors routine is what has plagued the criminal justice system, resulting in many wrongful convictions. We Push Back is about bringing attention to these informants who have little regard for the truth and offering a voice to all those impacted by their lies. This website will work as a united hub, bringing all related information to one portal. We Push Back.
Welcome back to A View from Mulberry Street. This is Matthew J. Mary, and I am your host. And we are going to continue on what we were doing last episode and to talk a little bit about famous, legitimate guys that I have met. I mean, we all know that Matthew Mary knows a lot of not so legitimate guys, and I'm proud to know those fellas. But I also know I have met, let's put it that way. I'm not saying Mickey Mantle is my friend, or Joe DiMaggio, or Larry David, but I got some funny stories, and I do want to not forget to talk about John F. Kennedy Jr., who was an assistant district attorney in Manhattan, and I had a couple of episodes with JFK Jr., who was really a fine young man. Anyhow, let's start off with Mickey Mantle. Mickey Mantle. Mickey Mantle is my idol, right? My childhood idol. And I'm at Mickey Mantle's restaurant one afternoon with Joe Bruno, the crime writer, former boxing writer, my friend. And we're just having lunch, having a nice weekday afternoon lunch. And Mickey Mantle's is crowded, not a person, not a seat empty. And as the afternoon goes on, we're sitting there having a few drinks, and it starts to empty out. And Joe Bruno says to me, "Did you see who's at the end of the room?" And I said, "No." And I look over, and who's sitting there but Mickey Mantle. And Mickey is sitting with a young lady and an older man, and he's at the table in the corner. And it seems that he was giving out these postcards and giving out his autograph. And so Joe Bruno says to me, I know Joe Bruno probably has a different story, but, that's Joe Bruno. Joe Bruno says to me, "Matt, might as well go over and get an autograph." And I was reluctant at first, and I decided, hey, what the hell, I'm here. So I walk over with Joe to Mickey Mantle's table, and he was resting, having a drink. And I say to Mick, I understand you're giving out autographs. Can you get me one? Can you give me one? And he says, certainly. And he starts to write out the autograph. And as he's doing that, I say to Mickey, I said, Mick, I want to thank you. And he looks up at me, bewildered, and says, thank me for what? And I said, when I was a little kid, I always would go to the stadium, and you were my hero. And I always expected big things from you, and you never disappointed me. You always did something great. And I pointed out the time that he had been injured for months, and he came back to hit a pinch hit home run. The whole stadium rocked. I mean, I've been in Yankee Stadium many times, and I've never experienced something that crazy as how the building was literally shaking. And, Mickey Mantle was the fans' favorite. And I said, Mick, you never disappointed me. I said, and in those days, and even today, when I can't sleep at night, I think back to those days, and I think back to those wonderful Yankee games in the 50s and the early 60s. And as I'm talking, like a tear comes to the Mick's eye, and he's like visibly shaken. And he says to us, sit down and have a drink. So there I am. Now I'm sitting down having a drink with my childhood hero, Mickey Mantle. And we do have a drink, and I certainly didn't want to outwear my welcome and wear. So I say to Mickey, I'd like to do something for you. And Mickey says, What might that be? And I say to him, well, what is your pal Billy coming to town? Meaning Billy Martin. And Billy Martin at that time was the manager of the Oakland A's baseball team. And Mickey, of course, had been retired for many years. And so I said to Mick, when is Billy coming in? He said, Billy will be in 2 weeks. So I pull out 2 business cards, 2 of these Matthew Mary cards. And I hand them to the Mick. And I say, Mick, one is for you, one is for Billy. And God forbid you guys get in trouble next time he's in town. You got a free arraignment on the house from Matthew J. Mary. And Mickey laughed like hell. And we had we said goodbye. And before he said goodbye, he gave me this autograph. So here it is, the famous autograph from Mickey Mantle, given to me that day. And I keep it. I keep it right on my desk, right over here. And it's been there for years and years and years. Another Yankee idol that I had, and of course I never saw him play, but Joe DiMaggio. Joe DiMaggio was the man. I think I mentioned Doc Rock Positano before. Doc Positano wrote a book called, I think it was Dinner with DiMaggio. It was so good, I couldn't put it down. It was great. Talked about Joe DiMaggio, in his later years, and how Dr. Rock would take him out and make sure he was protected and he wasn't bothered by anybody. Joe DiMaggio did not want to be approached. He was unapproachable, like a federal judge. You couldn't approach Joe DiMaggio. And so when I was kind of young, I was back in Fort Lauderdale Stadium again. And of course, Matthew Mary, I don't go there at 2 o'clock when the game starts. I go at 11 o'clock and nobody's there. And I'm walking around the whole stadium. And it's my first time there. And who do I see all alone? Joe DiMaggio. Okay, and Joe is walking around and I start following him. And Joe goes and gets a hot dog. And then I get a hot dog, and then Joe goes to buy some ice cream, and I go to get some ice cream, and then Joe goes to get a scorecard, and I go to get a scorecard, and then Joe just gave me a slight look, not like he was angry, but like, who the heck are you? And he did not offer his hand. He did not offer to say hello. And I thought I had gone as far as I could following Joe DiMaggio around the stadium and before anyone even got there for the spring training game. And I said to myself, maybe some other day, you, Matthew Mary, you'll get to meet the great DiMaggio. So, many, many years later, there was a fight going on. Buster Douglas on a big video screen. And we're at the Downtown Athletic Club. That's the famous home of the Heisman Trophy. It was a big deal downtown in Lower Manhattan where I lived. And there was a gentleman named Rudy Riska who was the manager of all that. He was in charge of everything. And Rudy got Joe Bruno and I some seats for the fight. And Rudy said to us, he said, because I know you guys are okay, he says, I'm going to put you right next to Joe DiMaggio. And he said, Matt, he said, if you position yourself in this particular seat and you get there early, I know that Joe is going to sit at the very next table. And so when you guys turn to watch the fight on the big screen, you, Matt, you're going to be right next to Joe DiMaggio. And so I told my friend Joe Bruno, Joe, by the end of this night, Matthew Mary and Joe DiMaggio, the great DiMaggio, we're going to be the best of friends. We're going to watch it. Just watch me work. And so we're waiting for Joe to show up. When Joe arrives, somehow a bunch of people who did not belong there go to the elevator and they accost him like, we want your autograph, we want your autograph, we want your autograph. Oh my goodness. And Joe was fuming. He was fuming. He had a red tie on and a white shirt and a blue suit. And his face was flaming red. And Joe started screaming. Oh, and he was calling for Rudy, the manager, and he screamed at Rudy and said, Rudy, you promised me that I would not be bothered by anyone, that this was a closed event, that it's only your friends, only good people here, no one's going to approach me. How dare you do this? Oh, boy. It was quite a scary experience. I have to say, I've been in the company of a lot of so-called gangsters. Haven't seen that many of them get as mad as Joe DiMaggio was that night. And so, in spite of the fact that Matthew Mary was sitting elbow to elbow on two different tables with Joe next to Joe DiMaggio, I didn't say a word. And so, that's my Joe DiMaggio story. Okay. We're going to get to Frank Sinatra pretty soon. Definitely we'll get to Frank. Joe Bruno and I went to the boxing writers' dinner one evening, and Muhammad Ali was the guest speaker. It was at the beginning of his inability to speak well. And so, you could tell something was wrong with the champ, but it was still a great honor to be there. And for some reason, naturally, Muhammad Ali came with his entourage, like 4 or 5 different people. And the boxing writers, New York boxing writers, didn't want to pay for his room in the room of his entourage. And he was appearing there for nothing. So, Joe Bruno, who was the vice president of the boxing writers, and I'm not going to mention any names of the people who came up against Muhammad Ali, but Muhammad Ali and his party, they were pretty angry, and it was almost a fight. And Joe Bruno and I and my friend Junior Calandra, we took the champ side. We were on Muhammad Ali's side, and we stood up for him, and we said our piece and said, hey, this guy is the most famous man in the world. He's coming here to speak for you for nothing. And you don't want to give him a room. You don't want to give his friends a room. And the bottom line was that they went along with us. And a couple of anti-Italian American commentaries that night, which I won't go into. And when I have Joe Bruno on the show, I'm going to stop him from going into it too, because it got almost a little ugly. But at the end of the night, the champ, Muhammad Ali, he shook hands with me and Joe Bruno and my friend Junior, and he said, thanks a lot, guys. And so there I was, Matthew Mary, defending Muhammad Ali, the champion of all the world, okay? That was an interesting evening, and I love that, okay? I want to move on to a couple of episodes with Frank Sinatra. I used to be a regular patron at a restaurant on 25th Street and 3rd Avenue. The name of the restaurant was called Separate Tables, Sepret, Tables, after the movie. And the owner of that restaurant was a very famous gentleman named Louie Pacella, Pacella. Louie Pacella had a nickname, Louie Dome. And Louie Dome was a very famous restaurateur. And the government said that he was somebody. And, they were always after Louie. Ultimately, Louie did get arrested and sent to jail over his involvement in the Westchester Premier Theater. And many of you may have seen that famous photograph of Frank Sinatra with Carlo Gambino and many, many other people from the Westchester Premier Theater. So the Westchester Premier Theater was a big deal. Louie had something to do with that, but he was famous for being the owner of Separate Tables, where many, many celebrities would go. But Louie and Frank Sinatra were best friends. And before I get to what happened in Separate Tables one night with my friend Louie Santos, who was a real tough guy. Louie Santos was a very, very tough guy. And everyone in the underworld knew who Louie Santos was. And anyhow, before I get to that, I'm going to take a little trip out to Las Vegas, all right? When I was a kid, I used to get put on a junket. I don't know who was behind the junket. I think it was Big Louie, Big Harry, Big somebody from Florida. And I somehow was put on that junket, and I would be able to go to Las Vegas and not pay a dime for anything. Not for the air flight, not for my room, not for meals. And when in those days, in the 1970s, when you were comped in Vegas, when you got a comp, it wasn't just at your hotel. It was in the whole city, okay? And so I'm walking down one of the main boulevards in front of Caesar's Palace, and I see a big sign that says Frank Sinatra. Oh, my God. I'm started to get nervous. I said, oh, I've got to get in to see Frank. You know, in my lifetime, I saw Frank Sinatra in person 22 times. I don't know what number that time was, but I could tell you I was sick because it was his last show that night, and I just arrived in Las Vegas, and I couldn't figure out how to get in there, and I called everybody I know. I mean, everybody. I called everybody in Las Vegas. I called everybody in New York, and I couldn't get to first base. And, you know, finally, I'm all dressed up. Outside the theater, outside the main hall in Caesar's Palace, the concert room. And I'm sitting at the bar there, hoping, praying that somebody might come in that I know who could get me in to see Frank Sinatra. And so finally, in desperation, I didn't want to do it. I called the separate tables, and I tried to get Louie Dome. And I never wanted to do that because Louie was my friend, and he told me that he's sick and tired of people harassing him to get tickets to see Frank Sinatra. And so I didn't want to do it, but I had to do it. Pick up the phone. The payphone, the bartender at separate tables, little Sally, he says, Louie's out of town. Sorry, Matt. Can't get him. Don't know how to get him. So I was dejected. I was really in a state of depression. I'm sitting there sulking, and who walks into the room? Louie Dome. Louie Dome walks in the room, and he looks over at me, and he says, hey, Matt, what are you doing here? And I say, I'm trying to see Frank Sinatra. Trying to get in to see Frank. And Louie says, well, come on in. You'll sit at my table. And I go on in, and I sit at Louie's table, which was actually Frank's table. And at the front of the table was Mrs. Sinatra, and there were 14 people at that table. And Matthew Mary was number 14, sitting at the end, sitting on the same table with Frank Sinatra's wife, and enjoying the show, and wondering how lucky can a guy get. And I am a pretty lucky guy. After the show, Louie Dome introduced me to Frank Sinatra in the, one of the lounges, and, we spoke a little bit. In fact, they were talking about Elvis Presley. And they were saying that, they were concerned about his health situation because of the pills and all that stuff. It was an interesting situation to be in, to be hearing Frank Sinatra talking about Elvis Presley, who he liked very, very much. Frank had said that he tried everything he could to help Elvis with that pill stuff, and he was unsuccessful. So before I get back to the separate tables and tell you about my other two meetings with Frank Sinatra, I just want to do one more Las Vegas story. I'm in Las Vegas on another trip, all right? And again, I have everything comped. The whole town I'm comped. There's nothing I could possibly want. But everybody that I knew said to me, when you get to Las Vegas, you must go to say hello to a guy named Jasper. Jasper was the owner of a pizzeria, a restaurant called the Leaning Tower of Pizza, okay? And it looked just like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And anyhow, because I had nothing to do, so I go over to see this gentleman, Jasper. And I say, hi, Jasper, my name is Matty. I know so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And they all said they want to say hello to you. And Jasper says to me, right off the bat, he says, nice to meet you. Anything you want in this town is yours. He said, except one thing. I cannot get you in to the Hilton International to see Elvis Presley. Now, at that time, I was not a big Elvis fan. I became an Elvis fan. But I wanted to have a little fun with Jasper. I don't know why I was so mischievous as a young man. And I said to Jasper, Jasper, I came to Las Vegas to do one thing, to see Elvis Presley. And they told me to see you. And that wasn't really true. But I just wanted to see what Jasper would do. And he said to me, okay. He said, listen, you should give me your room number, and I'll call you up in 3 or 4 hours. 3 or 4 hours, I get a call from Jasper who tells me that he's got 6 tickets for me, front and center, to see Elvis. And luckily for me, I had some friends in Las Vegas that were able to come with me to the event, and I saw Elvis Presley's show, and I can tell you, the show itself was unique, but I'll never forget that show. And after that, I became a true Elvis fan. It was just beyond belief. He had 54 people on the stage with him, and he put on one of the best shows that I've ever seen in my life. Okay, so let's get back to New York. Let's get back to the separate tables. Let's get back to Louie Dome. And my friend, Louie Santos, he was a very tough guy, but Louie Santos and Louie Pacella happened to be very good friends. And we were good customers in separate tables. So we're in separate tables. I think it's a Sunday night. We're sitting at the bar, and all of a sudden, Louie announces, Louie Dome, the owner, Frank's coming. So everybody gets all excited. Before you know it, the whole place is packed. You couldn't fit another person in the room, and there are people waiting outside to get in. And Frank Sinatra comes in with his bodyguards, and I don't know if I had met him yet in Las Vegas. I don't recall, but anyhow, Frank comes in, and so Louie, my friend Louie Santos, and I, we decide to be gracious and to give Frank our seats at the bar. So we get up and let him sit down, and he does in fact sit down. And then later, he goes into the back room, into the dining room to have dinner. And my friend Louie and I, we resume our seats. We go back to the seats we were in. And Frank Sinatra's bodyguard said, you're in Frank's seat. Don't you see his hat there? And Louie said, Frank was in our seats because we want to be respectful to him and to the owner. And the bodyguard says, no, Frank's hat is there. And so my friend Louie Santos, he took the hat, he threw it down on the ground, and he did the Mexican hat dance on it. And he picks the hat up and stuffs it in the guy's chest. And he said, now give that to Frank. Okay, next thing we know, Louie Dome comes running out and starts, screaming at us. What are you guys doing? Why are you doing this to me? Why are you causing me problems? When Frank comes here, it's my only time to make big money. And, I explained to Louie Pacella, what happened. And as soon as Louie heard that, he told the bodyguard to get out. He said, get out. And, he took our part, and we got to meet Frank after that. On another occasion, after we got to meet Frank, the next time he comes into town, we happen to be there again, and he's sitting in the back room, the dining room, with Lauren Bacall, just the two of them. I mean, there were bodyguards, but the bodyguards weren't sitting down. And Lou Pacella, the owner, Louie Dome, he says to me, and Louie, I want you guys to sit in the table in front of Frank so that he's got like a buffer to whoever might come into the restaurant. And we did that, and, we didn't talk to Frank or try to, be his pal. We did say hello, and I'll never forget, he stood there late, and Lauren Bacall kind of towered over him. She's a very tall woman, and at the end of the night, she kind of took Frank by the arm and escorted him very slowly out the door. So those are my Frank Sinatra stories, which are pretty good. I was a big fan of his. Like I say, 22 times I saw him. And it was always a pleasure to be with Louis Doman, separate tables. That was someplace. Along the avenue there's another place called the Still, also known as the Alley Cat. And I met some people in there, too. I met a guy named Billy Eckstine. Billy Eckstine was a great singer of his time. And Billy Eckstine used to come to the Still, and he actually would sit at the bar. We would put his records on the jukebox, and he would sit at the bar and sing to his records. And he was a good friend of a guy named Frankie LoCascio, Frankie Lo, who was accused by the government and was on trial with John Gotti, and was accused by the government of being John Gotti's consigliere. And poor Frank LoCascio, very nice guy, beautiful guy. He wound up dying in jail for being a defendant on the John Gotti case. The guy who owned the Still was a fellow named Little Joe Beckie, Joseph D. Palermo, and he was a character, beautiful man. And when Billy Eckstine used to come into the restaurant, he would sing along with him, and we'd have like a great time. Just to cover all the bases, I just want to say that, during the course of my radio show, my friend Carl Panarella, who's a singing star in his own right, a family friend of mine, he brought Pat Cooper onto my show, my radio show, the Matthew Mary Show in New Rochelle at WVOX. And I had Pat Cooper on that show, and I drove him from Manhattan and up to New Rochelle and back. And all the way through, even during lunch, every word out of Pat Cooper's mouth was a joke, and a good one. And so I really enjoyed the privilege of meeting Pat Cooper and having him on my show. Who else did I have on my show? Of course, I had Gianni Russo on there quite a few times. And other stars that I've met, that I've gone to their shows and met them and introduced to them and were able to talk to them through my friends in the underworld. Danny Aiello, who was just a beautiful person, and he was so kind to me and my wife and respectful, and it was a pleasure to meet him. Tony Danza, we met him twice, and he took us backstage and talked to us. At that time, our little daughter, Francesca, was in the industry. She had done a movie with Robert De Niro, Analyze This, and she had been on Broadway with Kenny Rogers for 57 performances. And Tony Danza said to us, my daughter was only like 12 or 11, and Tony said, listen, she's enjoying it fine, but once she hits 14 or 15, get her out of the industry. And I said, but why, Tony? He said, believe me, you don't want to know what goes on in Hollywood. And I'm glad that my daughter never went too far in that industry, because I guess we see now that there's a lot of nasty stuff was going on in Hollywood. What else? Larry David. Before I get to Larry David, I'm going to close with Larry David. But I also want to say that, I talked about Muhammad Ali, but I met some other people in the boxing world. Emil Griffith, I met him when I was a kid. Emil Griffith is famous because he not only knocked out a guy named Benny Kit Perret for the championship, but he killed Benny in the ring. And I was a young man, a young kid, and I got to talk to Emil Griffith in person because he knew somebody that I knew. And I talked to Emil Griffith about how does it feel to kill someone in the ring. Very interesting conversation. I also, during my travels, met George Foreman and was very impressed by him. Really, what a beautiful, beautiful man, respectful, kind, gracious, and I was proud to meet him. Another guy I met from the neighborhood, who was in the neighborhood, Rocky Graziano, also known as Rocky Graziano. And Rocky was the middleweight champion of the world. He was the sidekick of Martha Ray on TV in the 50s and was quite a guy. Everybody knew Rocky, and it was my privilege to meet Rocky several times, and he conferred with me as a lawyer a couple of times about a few things that were troubling him at the time. I just want to close out with a funny story about Larry David. You know, Larry David is one of my favorite characters on TV. Curb Your Enthusiasm. I love Larry David. In fact, many people, including my son, say that I, Matthew Mary, that I, in real life, am the Italian Larry David. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I like the character that Larry plays in Curb Your Enthusiasm. And in any event, I was a big fan, watched every episode. And so I'm walking to court one day in a suit and tie, much like I look right now, and I have my briefcase with me, and I'm walking through Chinatown on a winding street called Pell Street. It looks like it's another country. And Larry David is filming something there. And he's in his dungarees, his jeans, and his sneakers as usual, and he's directing whatever's going on. And I decided to have a little fun with Larry David. And I decided that if I could kid around with him and be persuasive enough, maybe I could push myself onto the show and to be part of the show that he was doing, because he always boasts and brags about how it's mostly improvisation on his TV shows. So anyhow, Larry's directing, and I walk up to him and I say, "Hey, are you Larry David?" And he says, "Yes." And why? I says, "Are you authorized to be here and to be doing what you're doing?" And he says to me, "Well, I have all the necessary permits and I could show them to you, but who are you?" He said, "What? Who? Are you a public official?" I said, "No, I'm not a public official." He said, "Well, who are you?" I said, "What do I look like?" He says, "Well, I don't know what you look like." I says, "I'm a lawyer." I said, "I'm a mob lawyer." And he said, "What?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Don't you know where you are?" I said, "You're in Chinatown." I said, "I grew up here." I said, "You know what's right down the block? Little Italy, Mulberry Street." I said, "Do you have the permission of the people in Little Italy to be here, to do what you're doing?" And he said, "No, I don't have no permission." And I said, "Well, who the hell, how the hell do you get the nerve to be here?" Now you have to keep in mind that I'm trying to impress Larry, like that I'm some kind of nut, so that eventually I would say, "Hey, Larry, I'm only kidding. Can you put me on your show? It sounds like a nice skit, It might work right into it." But instead of Larry stopping and talking to me and giving me a chance to tell him that I'm only kidding, Larry turns around and starts running like a deer. I mean, running like a deer. And I'm screaming, "Larry, Larry, come back." And Larry just keeps running and didn't stop. And I said to myself, "Oh my goodness, I think it's time for me to get out of here." And indeed, I got on my horse and I skedaddled right over to the courthouse. And I never saw Larry David again. I wonder who he thought that I really was. Anyhow, speaking of the courthouse, one last story. It's about John F. Kennedy Jr. John F. Kennedy Jr. was a handsome guy. He was an assistant district attorney in Manhattan for a period of time. And, they were grooming him, and they wanted to bring him along as a district attorney. And, he used to ride his bicycle every afternoon all by himself. No bodyguards, no friends. And he would ride down towards Knickerbocker Village. And John F. Kennedy Jr. was well known to the residents of Knickerbocker Village because he'd ride his bike through that neighborhood, stop and talk to people, chat with people. He was really a delightful person. And one time, I'm in the courtroom, and they had John F. Kennedy in the arraignment part. And he was there just to observe. He was a rookie. He just, got onto the job. And I'm representing a guy named Salvatore Lombardo. Sally Dogs. Yes, I've talked about him on the show before. And Sally Dogs was quite a notorious character. And Sally Dogs was arrested on a narcotics charge along with his wife. And they put his wife into it. And it was not nice from my point of view. And so I'm arguing to the state court judge, and you've got to understand there's a big difference between state court judges and federal judges. These state court judges are straight, they're legitimate, they're squares. They're not like the federal courthouse. And I said to the judge, Judge, I want you to release this man on bail. I want you to release his wife especially. I said, because they are not here because they have committed any kind of crime. They are here because the federal government, the FBI, federal prosecutors, they want to turn Salvatore Lombardo into a snitch. And he's not going to be a snitch. He'll never be a snitch, Judge. So they just brought him here, and they arrested his wife too, to try to put pressure on him. And the judge said, I forget the judge's name, oh, I don't believe stuff like that. I said, Judge, of course you don't believe stuff like that, because you've never walked down the block to 40 Foley Square, okay? 500 Pearl Street, the 2 federal courthouses. This stuff goes on night and day over there. I said, Judge, this guy is arrested not because of anything they think he did, and they're arresting his wife to put pressure on him because they want him to be a rat. I said, you know what a rat is? That's what they want him to be. He's not going to do it, and he never did. Sally Dogs did 11 straight years, and he would never cooperate. And anyhow, John F. Kennedy Jr. was sitting in the courtroom and was just laughing like hell. And, you know, when it was all over, like he said to me, I understand what's going on. And I kind of appreciated that. And later on, I had a case with John F. Kennedy Jr. It was a court-appointed case. And my guy was scheduled to get a disorderly conduct, like a plea bargain. And the prosecutor's office, not JFK Jr., but his bosses, superiors, they wanted the case to go to trial so that he could have an easy trial. And when he finally came down and the case was about to go to trial, you know, I said to him, I said, this isn't fair to this guy. I said, they want this case to go to trial so you can have an easy win. When we have a deal on the table that the guy's going to plead guilty to disorderly conduct, which is the lowest thing you could plead guilty to. I said, it's just not right. And John F. Kennedy Jr. looked at me and he said, you know what, Matt? He said, you're 100% right. I won't allow that to happen. And he walked up to the judge and to his superior and he said, we're giving this guy the deal. We're not doing that. So he's a man of great integrity and nice personality. And when he died in a plane crash, it was really a very, very tragic event. Well, there's a lot more to say about legitimate guys and the legitimate guys that I have known. But I think we've said enough on that subject for now. That's the view from Mulberry Street this week. This is Matthew Mary.